The courtroom fell silent as Judge Withers sneered at the young attorney. "Speak properly, Ms. Carter. This is a court of law, not a backwoods barn." Laughter rippled through the gallery, her face burning with humiliation. But they had no idea who they were mocking, or the storm she was about to unleash. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Emily Carter's fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the stack of neatly prepared documents on the wooden lectern. The courtroom's stale air felt thicker than usual, pressing against her chest with an invisible weight. Her voice, though clear and measured, carried the lilting warmth of her southern roots, a voice that had once soothed anxious clients and persuaded indifferent juries. But here, it became a weapon, not against the opposition, but against her. "Your Honor, I believe the statute in question clearly. Can you please try to speak properly, Ms. Carter?" Judge Harold Withers' voice sliced through hers like a blade. "This is a court of law, not a backwoods barn." A ripple of muted laughter rolled through the gallery, a poisonous murmur that twisted around her like thorns. Emily felt the heat bloom across her cheeks, her pulse pounding against her temples. Her grip tightened on the edge of the lectern, her knuckles whitening. She forced herself to breathe, to remember her preparation, the countless hours spent refining every line of her argument. But the confidence she had built crumbled beneath the mocking gazes of strangers, and worse, the indifferent glare of the judge himself. "Your Honor," she continued, trying to maintain her composure, "as I was stating, the precedents set by Carter v. Wilson—" "With respect, Ms. Carter," Judge Withers interrupted again, leaning forward, his lips curling into a smile that never reached his eyes. "You clearly don't understand the law. Your arguments are a waste of this court's time." Her mouth went dry. Every eye in the room seemed to narrow, her words collapsing before they even left her lips. Her opponent, a seasoned corporate attorney with graying temples and a smug, knowing smirk, didn't bother to conceal his amusement. Each glance, each whispered exchange among the court observers, dug into her like tiny daggers, their silent judgment louder than any gavel. But it was Judge Withers who held the heaviest blade. Every question she posed was met with a dismissive wave, every objection overruled without a thought. When she cited case law, he interrupted. When she quoted statute, he sighed, looking at the ceiling as if enduring a child's tantrum. "Let's move this along, shall we?" he drawled. "Ms. Carter seems determined to waste our afternoon." Her voice grew quieter, each syllable weighed down by the oppressive air of the room. The words that once danced with eloquence now stumbled, clipped and timid, shadows of what they were meant to be. And with each failed attempt to reclaim her argument, the laughter, distant but ever present, echoed louder in her ears. When the final ruling came, it was swift and cruel. Judge Withers dismissed her case without so much as a glance in her direction, his verdict a cold, formal rejection that landed with the force of a physical blow. Emily stood there, her vision blurring, the neatly ordered pages before her a useless heap of ink and paper. The courtroom emptied, voices fading into a muffled hum. But the sting remained, not just of the lost case, but of the crushing weight of humiliation. She had lost not because she was unprepared, not because her case was weak, but because her voice, her very identity, had been mocked, crushed beneath the heel of arrogance dressed as authority. Emily leaned against the cold marble wall, each breath a slow, deliberate struggle to keep from shattering. The courthouse lobby bustled with the indifferent rhythm of bureaucracy, attorneys in tailored suits rushing to their next argument, the shuffle of papers, the murmured exchanges of hurried clerks. But for Emily, everything was muffled, each sound warped and distant beneath the thunderous pounding in her ears. "Don't let him get to you." Mark's voice slipped into the fog of her thoughts, a feeble attempt at comfort. "He's always been like that. dismissive of anyone he thinks is beneath him. Beneath him. The words coiled around her heart, tightening with every breath. Beneath him. Was that all she was to Judge Withers? A nuisance? A child pretending at the law? Her voice and her words reduced to background noise simply because they carried a southern lilt? He hadn't just dismissed her arguments. He had dismissed her. Everything she stood for. Everything she had fought to become. But it was more than personal. It was a perversion of justice. A judge, the one person meant to embody impartiality, had turned the courtroom into his personal stage, where her voice wasn't just ignored, but mocked. It wasn't just the disdain in his words. It was the way he leaned back in his chair, a cruel smile tugging at his lips, as if every objection she made was a minor inconvenience in his otherwise comfortable afternoon. It was the quiet snickers from the gallery, the arrogant smirk of her opposing counsel, all encouraged by Withers' open disdain. Emily's hands trembled as she clenched them, her nails digging into her palms, a prickling pain that anchored her rage. She didn't hear Mark's next words, didn't see his sympathetic glance as he walked away. Her vision blurred at the edges, and all she could see was Withers, his mocking smile, his dismissive wave. She had gone to that courtroom prepared, every citation, every precedent carefully chosen, her arguments refined through sleepless nights. And yet, none of it had mattered. By the time she pushed off the marble wall, her mind was a seething maelstrom, each thought laced with a fire that refused to die. Her heels struck against the marble floors in sharp, deliberate clicks, each step pounding her anger deeper. When she reached her tiny office, a cramped space barely large enough for a desk and a bookshelf, she shut the door with more force than she intended, the sound echoing in the narrow hallway. Her briefcase fell open with a desperate, frustrated yank. Pages spilled across her desk, transcripts of the hearing, notes scribbled in her careful, precise handwriting, and the judge's official remarks, neatly typed and utterly venomous. Emily's eyes raced over the lines, her anger growing with every word. "You clearly don't understand the law, Ms. Carter. Try to speak properly. This is a court of law, not a backwoods barn." Each line struck like a whip, but it was more than just the insults. It was his absolute contempt, the way he overruled her without allowing a word of explanation, the way he leaned back, arms crossed, his expression one of bored amusement. He hadn't just rejected her arguments, he had silenced her. He had taken the courtroom, that sacred place where truth and fairness should reign, and turned it into a mockery. Her fingers traced the edges of the transcript, the thin paper crumpling beneath the force of her grip. Every line was a reminder, not just of her humiliation, but of something far darker. A judge who mocked a young attorney for her accent didn't just disrespect her. He betrayed the very ideals of the law. And suddenly, the anger shifted. It wasn't just a boiling storm, wild and uncontrollable. It became sharp, focused, like a blade honed to a lethal edge. Emily's breathing steadied, her pulse still thunderous, but now a war drum rather than a chaotic beat. This wasn't just about her pride. It was about every young attorney who had been silenced, every client who had lost a fair trial because their advocate was mocked or dismissed. Her gaze hardened, the reflection of the courthouse's fluorescent lights in the window casting a cold, stark shadow over her face. This wasn't over. It wouldn't be over until Judge Withers was held accountable. And if he thought her voice was a joke, if he thought she was beneath him, he was about to learn that the law had a voice of its own, and she would make it thunder in his ears. Justice wasn't just an idea to Emily. It was a vow, a promise forged in late nights studying case law, in endless hours defending clients who couldn't afford to lose. But Judge Withers had turned that promise into a cruel joke, his courtroom a stage where dignity and integrity were crushed beneath his arrogance. Emily's anger, once a seething storm, became something colder, sharper, a relentless determination that would not rest until truth shattered his facade. Her investigation began with whispers, quiet conversations in courthouse corridors, knowing glances exchanged with other young attorneys, the cautious nods of those who had faced Withers' contempt and chosen silence. Emily approached them, her voice calm but her gaze unyielding. "It's not just you," they told her. "He's always been that way. If you're young, if you're a woman, if you don't look like what he thinks a lawyer should look like, he doesn't just ignore you. He tears you down." One by one, the stories unfolded, each one a thread in a tapestry of corruption. A young Latina lawyer whose carefully researched arguments were met with eye rolls and sighs. An Asian American attorney who had been told to speak English clearly, despite his flawless, articulate presentation. A black public defender whom Withers openly mocked for grandstanding when he passionately defended his client's rights. Names, dates, case numbers. Emily recorded them all, her notebook becoming a damning record of Withers' abuse of power. But that wasn't enough. Emily knew that stories alone would be swept aside, dismissed as misunderstandings or exaggerations. She needed evidence, real, undeniable proof. Her evenings became a blur of documents and transcripts, pages spread across her tiny office like a battlefield map. Court transcripts where Withers' dismissive tone was captured in cold, unfeeling text. His interruptions, his refusals to allow objections, his outright insults. She highlighted each instance, building a wall of shame with his own words. She obtained audio recordings where his condescension dripped like venom. The audio didn't just capture his words, it captured the sneer in his voice, the bored disdain as he wielded his authority like a weapon. But it was the pattern that was the most damning. Emily didn't just find one or two cases. She found dozens. Dozens of lawyers who had walked into Withers' courtroom with hope and walked out with humiliation. Her anger burned away the exhaustion, her determination carving through the fog of fatigue like a blade. Sleep became a distant memory. Coffee and adrenaline were her only companions. Finally, with a mountain of evidence at her command, Emily filed a formal complaint with the Judicial Conduct Commission. Her letter was a masterpiece of precision. Dates, cases, direct quotes from transcripts, and personal testimonies. It wasn't an accusation. It was an indictment. But she didn't stop there. Emily understood that silence was the soil where injustice thrived. She began reaching out to her network, law professors who remembered her tenacity, mentors who had watched her grow from an eager law student into a fierce advocate. One of them, a retired appellate judge, was horrified as she laid out her findings. This is a systemic abuse of judicial authority, he whispered, his voice tinged with disbelief. And you're going after him? I'm not just going after him, Emily replied, her voice calm but steely. I'm bringing him down. Through her connections, she secured something few would ever dare to dream of, a hearing in front of the state Supreme Court. Her complaint would not be buried in the endless bureaucracy of the commission. It would be heard, and it would be judged. Withers would not be able to sneer his way out of this. But even as she prepared for the hearing, something gnawed at her. She knew Withers would fight back, deny everything, claim his words were misunderstood or taken out of context. He would use his years of authority like a shield, his reputation like a sword. She needed one final blow, one irrefutable, undeniable proof that would shatter his defenses and expose him for what he was. A monster in robes, a tyrant who had perverted justice itself. Emily sat back, her eyes burning from the strain, her fingers aching from hours of typing and sifting through records. But her gaze was fierce, her resolve unbroken. The courtroom had been his arena. his stage for cruelty and scorn. But now, she was dragging him onto a new stage, one where his power meant nothing and only the truth would stand. This wasn't about vengeance. This was about justice, and Emily Carter was ready to bring the hammer down. The Grand Hall of the State Supreme Court was a fortress of marble and shadow, its vaulted ceiling stretching into a dome of solemn authority. Gold-etched columns framed the rows of dark mahogany pews, now filled with a sea of curious faces. Attorneys, law clerks, journalists, even a few civilians who had heard rumors of the impending spectacle. The air hummed with a charged electric tension, a quiet murmur that ceased the moment the heavy double doors swung open. Judge Harold Withers entered with the same self-assured stride that had once made attorneys wither beneath his gaze. His gray hair was neatly combed, his robe pristine, and his familiar, smug smile sat comfortably on his lips. But the moment his eyes settled on the plaintiff's table, where Emily Carter stood with quiet, unyielding confidence, a shadow of uncertainty flickered across his face. "Ms. Carter?" he sneered, the sneer that had once crushed her arguments beneath its weight. "This is a waste of—" "Your Honor," interrupted the presiding Supreme Court Justice, his voice sharp, cold as a winter wind cutting through stale air. "You are here to answer for allegations of judicial misconduct. Please refrain from speaking unless addressed directly." The color drained from Withers' face, his jaw tightening as he sank into the chair reserved for the accused. The murmurs in the gallery swelled briefly before being silenced by a stern glance from the bailiff. Emily stood, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Her posture was steady, her expression calm, but beneath that calm was a storm of iron-willed determination. Her voice filled the chamber, clear and unapologetically Southern, every word precise, every syllable a weapon honed for this moment. "Honorable Justices," she began, her tone respectful but resolute. "This is not merely a case of judicial misconduct. It is a case of abuse of authority. The evidence I present today will demonstrate a pattern of discriminatory behavior by Judge Withers, behavior that has tainted the integrity of his courtroom." She moved methodically, a masterful litigator in full command of her battlefield. She began with the transcript from her own case, the familiar lines seared into her memory. "Can you please try to speak properly, Ms. Carter? This is a court of law, not a backwoods barn." A ripple ran through the audience. Emily continued, her voice unwavering. "I have here sworn statements from multiple attorneys, young, experienced, men, women, individuals from various racial and cultural backgrounds, all of whom have experienced similar treatment under Judge Withers. Their cases were not just argued. They were silenced." She displayed a chart of overruled objections, each instance marked in bold, the numbers painting a damning picture. More evidence followed. Audio recordings where Withers' condescension was palpable, his sneers and sighs a soundtrack of contempt. But it was the final exhibit that shattered the room's tension like glass. A video clip, a recording of a courtroom where Withers leaned back in his chair, rolling his eyes as a young black attorney made her closing arguments. His whispered words, caught on the audio, rang clear. "These amateurs don't even know how to speak properly." The silence was absolute. The Supreme Court justices leaned forward, their expressions grave, some with thin lines of anger etched in their faces. Judge Withers shifted uncomfortably, the smirk long vanished. He opened his mouth, but one glance from the Chief Justice silenced him. The weight of the evidence bore down on him, heavier than any robe of authority he had ever worn. Finally, the Chief Justice turned to Withers. His voice was a blade, precise and unyielding. "Judge Withers, the evidence presented is overwhelming. Your actions constitute a clear abuse of judicial authority. Your conduct has violated the principles of fairness and impartiality that are the foundation of our legal system. A single sharp rap of the Chief Justice's gavel punctuated his words. "You are hereby suspended, pending further investigation and disciplinary action. The bailiff will escort you out." The room erupted into murmurs, the rising wave of voices a tide of shock and vindication. Withers stood, his face ashen, his shoulders slumped. Gone was the towering figure of arrogance. In his place was a broken man, his steps slow and heavy as the bailiff led him through the side door. Emily remained standing, watching as he vanished from view, a wave of satisfaction washing over her. But it wasn't a wild, jubilant joy. It was calm, like the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. Justice wasn't loud. It didn't roar. It was the quiet, unyielding strength of truth laid bare. The justices rose, the hearing formally adjourned, but the gallery remained, a sea of eyes fixed on her. Emily gathered her notes with careful precision, her hands steady, her expression composed. Yet beneath that calm, a fierce pride burned. Not just for herself, but for every voice that had been silenced by Withers' arrogance. She stepped out of the courtroom, the marble floors that once seemed cold and oppressive, now a path of quiet triumph beneath her heels. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, questions fired like arrows. But Emily's voice was clear, her words powerful. "Justice is not the privilege of the powerful," she said, her southern accent unapologetically strong. "It belongs to everyone." And with that, she walked away. No longer just an attorney who had once been mocked, but a force of justice who had struck down a tyrant. The courthouse steps were a sea of chaos. Reporters surged forward, a tide of microphones and cameras, their flashing lights an electric storm against the overcast sky. Voices overlapped in a relentless barrage of questions. "Ms. Carter, do you think Judge Withers will be permanently disbarred?" "Emily, were you ever afraid to take on a sitting judge? Did you expect to win so decisively?" But through the frenzied cacophony, Emily Carter walked with a steady, unhurried grace, her chin held high, her expression calm but resolute. The brisk autumn wind tugged at her coat, but she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had not just won a case. She had won a war. "Ms. Carter!" one reporter shouted, leaning forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "How does it feel to have defeated Judge Withers?" Emily paused, a subtle, unforced smile touching her lips. The world seemed to hold its breath. Her voice was steady, clear, and unapologetically Southern. The same accent that had once been mocked in Withers' courtroom now carried with pride and power. Justice isn't about who speaks the loudest or who speaks with the right accent. It's about truth. Her words sliced through the clamor, each syllable ringing with the force of conviction. There was a heartbeat of silence, then a fresh wave of camera shutters erupted, and the murmurs of admiration rippled through the crowd. But Emily didn't linger. She moved past the reporters, their questions fading into background noise. Her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a flood of notifications, texts, missed calls, emails. But one message stood out among the rest. "Impressive work, Ms. Carter. We'd like to discuss an opportunity with you." The sender, Richard Voss, senior partner at Latham & Westbrook, one of the most prestigious law firms in the state. Emily stared at the message, the weight of it settling in, but instead of the wild excitement she might have once felt, there was a calm, measured satisfaction. Because this wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It was earned. Every sleepless night spent combing through case files, every painful moment of humiliation in Withers' courtroom, every whispered story she had collected from other silenced attorneys. They had all led here. Her triumph wasn't just over a corrupt judge. It was a triumph over doubt, over fear, over the voice in her own mind that had once wondered if she was good enough. Emily slipped the phone back into her coat pocket and continued walking. The courthouse behind her loomed like a fortress she had conquered. A place that had once symbolized mockery and defeat now stood as the monument to her victory. The marble steps, the grand columns, the windows that had once reflected her small, trembling figure now framed a woman transformed. Pedestrians on the sidewalk glanced at her, some with quiet recognition, a few with hesitant smiles of admiration. A young law student, clutching a stack of textbooks, paused, staring at Emily with wide, hopeful eyes. Emily met her gaze and gave a small nod, a silent promise that courage and truth were always worth fighting for. But even as she walked away, her thoughts were clear. This wasn't the end. It was a beginning. A reminder that justice was never a gift, but a battle. One she was prepared to fight again, for herself, for those who were silenced, for the very idea of fairness. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves along the sidewalk, but it did nothing to unsettle her calm. Emily Carter was no longer just an attorney. She was a voice, one that could not be dismissed, could not be mocked, and would never again be silenced.